So what are we talking about today? Today's educational webcast is titled Investing During Inflation and Changing Economic Conditions. I think that all would agree there's a lot of changing going on. I'm not going to comment at all on the recent midterms and all of that area because I've generally experienced over the 30 plus years in the industry that affects somewhat of the market, but it doesn't have the quantitative effect you might think. So today we'll talk about this topic, and the first slide up is our disclosure, and not meant to be specific for anyone who's viewing or listening. If you have specific questions, please ask your own planner, advisor, CPA. So let's get started. Always helpful to have a quick definition about what the topic is. So inflation. We all know, in our day-to-day lives, what it means, in terms of cost of goods and daily living, from food to gasoline to clothing. But I like to use the example where we all can relate to it, the small cup of coffee. So if we look at the last 50 years or so, the small cup of coffee basically went up almost 300%, from 25 cents to almost $2. But translate that to kind of inflation, the inflation rate that works out to about 5.2% annual inflation on a cup of coffee. And interestingly, that is close to what you might consider core inflation. Real inflation right now is probably more like 7.9. The US government does not take into account consumer durables and energy in their inflation benchmark. But if you take into account, what I consider core inflation, which has been the historical way that government defines inflation, it's about 5%, more so probably in the mid to high threes. But I think the 5% range is reasonable if you think of any kind of goods or you're working. So, moving along in terms of a few more definitions, the consumer price index is what you might see noted in the news all the time, or on your computer, or flashing up on your iPhone. CPI. What is that? It's including all of these 8 areas. So just covering them briefly, you've got clothing, transportation, could be automobile, bus, airplane, education and communication. You need to buy items, to go to K through 12. You need to buy items to trade school. You need to buy items for college. Goods and services. Other goods and services might be just getting your basic haircuts, grooming. Recreation could be gym, working out if you're a member of a club. Medical care, health care, obviously visiting the doctor, going for your MRIs, getting pharmaceuticals, CVS fill-ups. Food and beverage, that's going to the grocery store, or maybe you go out to eat. And housing is real estate, be it rental, be it owning. All of these make up the CPI, and they're all obviously being impacted, some more ways than others. But kind of, keeping on this theme, so you understand inflation better, let's take it into the investment discussion. What does well during inflation? You'd be surprised. There's a lot of areas of our economy that have an uptick during inflationary times. Even though you're not feeling it now, all you're seeing is technology in the news taking a tough hit this year. Layoffs are happening at different areas in technology. Amazon's certainly been in the news. Microsoft trimming back a little, but I think we agree those companies are not going to go out of business. They've just been through a ferocious period of growth the last 12 or 13 years, some of them growing at the tune of 25 to 35% a year. That had to slow down. But what does the sector of the economy look like in this current inflationary time that we're in? Look at the area consumer discretionary. That area, of course, has been hit probably one of the hardest areas. That's items you don't necessarily need, right? I don't maybe necessarily need to buy a new car. I don't necessarily need to go buy, the third or fourth, pair of shoes. Maybe I can get by without things. I don't need to necessarily go out to eat as often, so I'm cutting back. So those companies in that space, Disney is probably considered discretionary pay, right? You don't necessarily have to go to Disney and cut back. that space has not done well this year for those reasons I outlined. However, historically, it's done pretty well. Consumer staples, however, are things you do need, right? Everybody needs the food. Everybody needs to gas up the car. Everybody needs to, buy goods for their kids' school. Those are areas you have to have purchases in. And that's a minus, but yet a very low minus this year. Compared to the S&P as of last night was probably more like minus 18.2 year to date. So consumer staples have been steady, and over time they're steady. Energy, it's on the list because it's part of the marketplace, but it's been an outlier this year, right? The cost of gas, the crisis, over in the Ukraine, shipping issues, obviously fossil fuels in the news a lot, is things going a little more green. However, we still need a lot of petroleum to produce products that go into housing and services, automobile parts and components. But that area is a little outlier this year, but historically it's done pretty well. Financials are banks, insurance companies, institutions. Again, a minus is never good, but it's not as significant a minus. Why? Because banks are experiencing a little uptick with interest rates as they go up. Yeah, borrowing may come down a little with mortgages, but nonetheless, credit card rates go up. Their ability to make money goes up at the bank when interest rates are raised up. Healthcare is a beneficiary still of the pandemic. Industrials, again, tend to be hard industries. You think of Rubbermaid, I think industries that make a lot of components in housing products, the dishwasher, the stove, that area has still been steady, even though it's lost money. Technology obviously has taken a hard hit. We talked about materials, real estate, another tough area, right? How is the, not just the housing area, but how is the office building market going to do during this different times of hybrid work? Communication, very competitive marketplace. AT&T, Verizon, any of those communication areas. It's kind of pennies on the dollar. It's a volume business. The margins are thin. And obviously, offices are now cutting back too, less landline phone usage in those areas. So historically, that's not been a good area as well for growth, as you can see. And utilities, again, I would say another area that is done well in inflationary times will continue, right? Eversource, National Grid. You have to have these areas, to run your house, to run your building. So I'd say if you look at the three areas, consumer staples, healthcare, and utilities, those are good inflationary investments that we're going to talk a little more about. So as we kind of go on in our discussion, this is again a chart that looks, wavy, so to speak. It's almost a 100-year chart that displays inflation. So if you go back to 1914, you can see a huge spike at that point. And then come in around 1929, 1930, you can see that there was a downdraft inflation because there was obviously a sell-off in the market at that time, the Great Depression. But historically, if you look at this graph, the average is about 3.3 or so over the last 100 years. And that's what I would suggest to you is what the Federal Reserve is trying to solve for. I would say more like in that 4 to 5% range for real inflation that they're trying to solve for. So when you kind of look, and as we kind of look forward here a little more in the discussion, how does inflation affect interest rates? I think we've seen it. This year alone, there's been 5 increases the Federal Reserve has put in to the tune of about 3.75%. The idea behind that is a little bit of a change to the short-term interest rate borrowing to slow down the economy. Now, it's tricky because you want to make sure you don't put us into a stagflation where you have zero growth and high inflation. I don't believe that's going to occur, but what you have to keep your eye on is the short-term interest rate environment has impacted, obviously, in the mortgage marketplace, the ability to borrow money at a lower rate. I mean, just a year and a half ago, you probably could get 30-year mortgage money at 3%. Now it may be more on that 7.5% range. That slowed down the economy somewhat, but it hasn't dramatically impacted the unemployment, which is still at 3.6, 3.7. But what it has done, I'll give you a suggestion, take a look at short-term yield type accounts. And there's a couple that come to mind. If you look at Marcus, which is an online bank supported by Goldman Sachs, if you look at Capital One, which is the big credit card company, they have high yield accounts over 3% now. There's nothing that's, any kind of tie up of your money. They're very liquid accounts, but those type of short-term high yield accounts have been a good beneficiary of the Federal Reserve changing interest rate. So as we kind of look forward a little more here in more definitions, let's kind of get into kind of your everyday life. What can you affect positively and what helps you in an inflationary time investing and can keep in control of, your own expenses. A lot of discussion about this the last 3 years, that fintech area, they call it. Everyone knows about being the Uber Eats driver and the delivery, but there's a lot of other good areas that you should think about if you're trying to get, a little extra side income. The one or two that have been very popular, the influencer, they call it, the online social media use to maybe influence a new product or service. There's actually a pretty good marketplace to join, earn some extra income that way. Everyone knows Rover, the dog walker service becomes super popular, right? I'm a big dog fan myself. I mean, my wife and I are still working, so someone has to come during the day. Third idea is, some kind of freelance writing, online about, again, a product or service. A lot of these big industries are looking for that kind of help because why? You provide them a 1099 type of role. They don't have to be concerned about their benefits and all those costs, and you can make extra side income. So why I'm bringing this up is people may feel a little stretched when they think of inflation and their cost of running the household. Think about the idea, maybe some quote unquote side hustle. So as we kind of look at these other blocks and identify them better for you, budget sounds, really basic. You may say, well, of course I got a budget, Dave. But do you, in terms of writing it down, or just even if you keep a notepad, maybe you do a quick Excel spreadsheet. But I think if you kind of identify better where your money's going, monthly, quarterly, you'll be a little more comfortable, right? It won't stress you out as much, that you feel like, oh my goodness, I'm working. Doesn't look like there's a lot left over at the end. So as we kind of look at the next item to identify savings, I mentioned this just a minute ago, but do look at these high yield savings accounts. Capital One, Marcus, I believe American Express even has an option for high yield savings. Take advantage of these very good rates of return because unfortunately your banks are not going to offer a very good high yield savings rate. That's just not their focus. They're not being legislated into having to offer a higher rate of return. They're still in the credit card, mortgage type of business. So when you look at those kind of savings accounts, that'll enhance, at least the rate of return of your cash that you're using. So next up is we kind of cover the fourth box, inflation investing, I'm calling it. Everyone has been looking at the headlines this year. They haven't certainly been too pleasant in terms of our stock market, even our bond market. So what are areas to identify, whether you're just saving through the 401k, you're saving college savings for your son or daughter, you're doing some savings on your own, you're trying to update something in the house. This is 6 areas to think about that, again, generally do well during inflationary times. And I would suggest you are probably going to be in this type of investment window the next, 3 to 5 years. Where the technology is slowed down. Again, it does not mean Amazon and Apple and Microsoft will go out of business. Of course not. But they're slowing way down. But what picks up in that area, tips is one idea. So Treasury inflation protected security. You can buy a mutual fund. You can buy an ETF. You can look it up online with Direct Treasury, which reminds me as well, there is a feature offered by our U.S. government. It just closed the end of October. They were offering an I-bond, they call it. You could buy up to $10,000 per person, and they were paying almost 9.4%. That closed. Now the rate is 6.8. Still a very good rate of return. It's a sort of a 3 to 5 year obligation, but that's a very good interest rate for any cash. I think the minimum was 1,000 and the max was 10,000. So that's kind of in the treasury. A stable value fund is more of a fixed account. You have that type of fund, say in a 401k plan. You also have access to that type of account, as I mentioned, through Capital One, through Marcus, through American Express. Chase, I believe, even has, a higher yield type of account. Short-term bonds, again, tend to be the place to be in inflationary time. Don't go much beyond a 2-year period when you're looking at bond investment. Dividend paying investment is probably the focus in this type of market. That tends to be, the company may not be as appealing to you, but Philip Morris, they've been around obviously 100 plus years. Maybe they don't identify with you in terms of the markets they're in, tobacco and alcohol and kind of fast food, but they've always done very well as a company. Good growth, reasonable growth every year, 6-7% on the stock, and a dividend in that 3% range. Those are the type of areas in the dividend paying areas that you will see do well in the next 3 to 5 during kind of inflationary time or unknown times for the growth area and the tech area. That example in, say, a 401k, or that example in your own investing might be an equity income fund with a Vanguard, a large value type of fund. You'll see a dividend paying fund. You'll see them listed online. Real estate investment trust. This is, again, not your home, not your residential. This is related to real estate that focuses on 3 areas. Cloud computing requires a ton of real estate to store servers in the back office. Warehouse space is big. Amazon, think Amazon, Costco, Walmart, BJ's. And of course, life sciences and biomedical. There's always going to be a race to develop the next vaccine, right? For COVID, there's always going to be a race for the next vaccine. For the flu, trying to identify a cure for Alzheimer's, ALS, and all those areas. Commodities is a big area to finish up with. That tends to be areas that are metals, areas that go into a lot of electric cars, a lot of those components. And remember, there's a ton of commodity need in computers and phones and your laptops and your iPad. So as we kind of work through it, we'll just kind of buzz through this quickly, but here's a slide for you to take away and study about tips. Next up, a little more clarification on short-term bond. Again, as I recommended, I would suggest you have a bond that has a 2-year or less maturity. Same with a bond fund. Some disadvantages, and they're not going to appreciate as high as a stock, but they're generally going to be less volatile. So as we kind of go through this, dividend paying investment, again, I'll spend a little more time on this. This is an area, again, I would encourage you all to think strong about in terms of during inflationary times, during a slowdown, maybe you have a slight recession. These type of companies, if you look from the bottom up, consumer staple, healthcare, financials, utility, energy, and they tend to be companies that identify products and services we all need, right? I mean, you still need the bank to make your deposits. You still need to go to the doctor or the hospital. You still need to buy food and groceries for the house. You still need energy to heat your house or cool your house. Industrials, you're probably still going to need an automobile or update your car or whatever in that area. So those tend to be areas that will get through inflationary times and slowdowns better. Again, within your 401k, within your other investments that you're doing, you could identify those areas by what are called equity income funds, growth and income funds, ETFs, which they call them, or dividend paying ETFs, and as examples. So as we kind of get into the discussion here about real estate, again, I would just refresh you on this discussion. It's not about your house value is maybe fluctuating a little, but I think I would suggest probably a lot of fluctuation hasn't hit the residential real estate market significantly like 2008, even though rates have gone up. But this area of investment options, inflationary investment, again, is related to biomedical life science, any kind of data storage, cloud computing, and then warehouse space. Self-storage as well is another big area of growth. People moving around a lot. I think of my own kids. I mean, they may do a different rental every year or two. They got to store some of their stuff. They store it in a self-storage area. This hopefully will kind of, bring it together somewhat in the discussion. What is it, what does this all mean when you kind of invest during times of inflation? And what does it mean in terms of, both the short, medium, and long term? I think the thing to focus on right now is the bottom right, we have negative growth and we have positive inflation. So what areas are doing well? On the far right, obviously the commodity area, gold, tend to be hedges, but more so in the commodity areas I mentioned, these are areas that are needed right now as there's a transition happening slowly but surely from fossil to green to energy to electric. Commodity also growth has gone up exponentially during the pandemic because of the use of electronic devices, because more people working remote. However, I think what's going to happen eventually over time in the next 12 to 24 months is the top right, where you're going to start to have more positive growth and you're going to have still a little bit of inflation. So you can see kind of the mix tends to get more in line with each other, if you will. So U.S. stock, we're in negative growth, positive inflation. U.S. stocks are way down on a historical average. However, if you start to have more positive growth, which I can foresee, and then you still have inflation, it's not going to go away, you start to have more symmetry, if you will, or sameness in different areas of the economy, real estate, natural resource, bonds come back a little more, and the gold commodity pulls down a little bit because inflation is more in check. So with that, I just want to give a big thank you to everybody who listened today, and a big thank you to obviously Peabody for continued business. The idea again from today is to kind of open your mind to realizing inflation is kind of tough to stomach kind of when you hit the shopping for your, normal goods and services of food and clothing and gasoline and things. But from a point of view of investing, there are some good long-term opportunities. So keep that in mind. I had a couple questions that came in on, where to find different types of investment opportunity. So here are the links Anthony put in. So if you want to click through any of these, they tend to have some good information on different sectors and the different conversations we've had today on what areas of the economy do well during inflation, what areas of investing do well during inflation. So I would suggest you kind of use this as a resource. Thank you again. Everybody enjoy your day.